All right, listeners, buckle up because today we're going deep, really deep into the world of hydraulic fracturing.
Sounds exciting.
It is. And, we're not just talking about getting oil and gas out of the ground. We're going way beyond that.
Right.
This deep dive is all about what makes a frac job a truly effective one. Like, what are the secrets? And you know what?
Yeah.
You've sent us a super interesting, very technical document, actually, that really dives into the engineering
Mm-hmm.
behind these fractures and how to optimize them to get the most out of those wells.
It gets pretty in-depth.
Oh, I bet. And I hear it uses some pretty creative analogies, too.
Oh, yeah, there's some good ones in there. We're talking highways, feeder roads, even rush hour travel.
Oh, I love a good analogy. Helps me really grab the complex stuff.
Definitely.
So let's start with the basics. We know hydraulic fracturing makes these cracks in the rock
Yeah.
to help oil and gas flow better.
Hmm.
But what surprised me reading this document is that things like formation thickness or, its porosity,
Right.
those aren't the biggest factors when it comes to designing the fractures themselves.
That's true. Those factors are important for deciding if you're going to fracture in the first place. But when it comes to the actual design of the fracture,
Yeah.
permeability is the key. It's like, think of it like driving.
Okay.
If you have a smooth open highway versus a congested city street,
Yeah.
the easier the flow, the better the well performs. But measuring that permeability accurately, that's the tough part.
Okay, so permeability is key, but tricky to measure.
Yes,
That's got to be a real challenge for engineers.
it is.
I mean, how do they design these fractures if they can't get a good read on the permeability?
That's where those two pillars of fracture success come in. Fracture length and fracture conductivity.
All right, break those down for me. What makes a fracture good in terms of length and conductivity?
Okay, so picture the fracture like a pathway for the oil and gas to travel through.
Okay.
Fracture length is simply how long that pathway is, and ideally you want it to stretch equally on both sides of the wellbore. Longer fracture equals more access to those oil and gas resources.
Makes sense. So longer the better.
Pretty much, yeah.
But what about conductivity? What makes that pathway an efficient highway for the oil and gas?
Conductivity is all about how easily the oil and gas can flow within the fracture itself. It depends on how wide the fracture is and the permeability of that proppant pack. Essentially, how much space is there for the oil and gas to move through, and how easily can it do it?
Got it. So it's like not just the length of the road, but also how wide and clear those lanes are.
Exactly.
You need both for that smooth flow.
You got it. It's a balancing act. And that's where dimensionless fracture conductivity, or CFD, comes into play.
Okay, CFD sounds technical. How does that help engineers find that sweet spot between length and conductivity?
Think of CFD as a ratio that balances the fracture's length and conductivity. It's like if you're comparing a highway's capacity to carry traffic to the ability of those feeder roads to supply that traffic,
Okay,
you need both for a well-functioning system.
I see where you're going with this. So is there an ideal CFD that engineers shoot for?
There is, yeah. A CFD of around 2 is considered the sweet spot for long-term productivity. Think of it like hitting that perfect flow where the highway can handle the incoming traffic smoothly. It means your fracture is efficiently handling the flow from the surrounding rock formation.
So 2 is our magic number.
Yeah, for that nice, steady, reliable flow.
Got it, like a well-synchronized transportation system. But what about those times when you need more capacity, like during rush hour? Does that affect that ideal CFD?
That's a good point. Just like you might need wider highways during rush hour,
Yeah.
a higher CFD might be desirable for those peak flow periods. But going much higher than 50 is usually overkill.
Okay, so there's a limit.
Yep.
That makes sense. So it seems like CFD is really powerful for making that frac job as efficient as possible. But you mentioned earlier that permeability plays a big role too. How do those two factors kind of work together?
This is where the source material gets really creative. They actually use the analogy of Route 66 versus Loop 610 to illustrate how permeability influences fracture design.
Okay, I'm hooked. How do those two very different highways explain the relationship between permeability and fracture design?
So imagine driving across sparsely populated areas on Route 66. That's like a low permeability formation. You need long stretches of road, those long fractures, to reach more resources, even if the road itself isn't super wide.
So in low permeability formations, length is key because the oil and gas are spread out. You need those longer fractures to reach it all.
Exactly. Now, picture navigating a busy city on Loop 610. That's like a moderate to high permeability formation. Shorter fractures are often enough here because the oil and gas flow more easily from the formation. What becomes more important is a wider, more conductive fracture, like a wider highway to handle that increased flow.
So it's like a balancing act. High permeability means you can focus more on conductivity, while low permeability means prioritizing length. Fascinating. But are there any other factors that come into play when you're designing a successful frac job?
Absolutely there are. And there's this fascinating concept called transient flow that can really impact a well's early production. and it adds another layer to consider.
Transient flow. Tell me more. What makes it so important?
It's basically a period of higher than expected production early in a well's life. Think of it like the initial rush of commuters hitting the highway at the start of rush hour.
Okay.
During this time, production comes primarily from the area near the fracture face, leading to those higher initial rates.
So it's like a temporary boost in productivity. How long does that usually last?
It can actually last for months or even years, making it potentially a really big factor in a well's overall profitability.
Wow, that is a big deal. So how does that influence the overall design of the frac job?
The source material gives a great example. A well with a lower CFD might have lower initial rates but a flatter decline over time, while a high CFD well might have those higher initial rates but decline more rapidly.
So it's a trade-off, slow and steady versus that quick burst of production. Seems like a lot to think about when you're designing these frac jobs for those long-term results.
It is, and it's not just about those propped fractures we've been discussing. There are alternative methods for enhancing conductivity, like acid fracturing.
Acid fracturing, I've heard of that but don't know much about it. How does that compare to the propped fracturing approach?
Acid fracturing uses acid to actually etch the rock instead of relying on proppant to keep those fractures open. It can create really high conductivity, but the length of those etched pathways is limited by things like how much fluid is lost and how long it takes for the acid to react with the rock.
So it's like a trade-off, high conductivity but limited length, versus those potentially longer fractures with lower conductivity. How do they decide which approach is best?
That decision often comes down to, you guessed it, permeability. Acid fracturing tends to be more effective in formations with moderate to high permeability, while propped fracturing is generally preferred for those low permeability formations.
Seems like permeability is the recurring theme here.
It is.
Choosing the right tool for the job.
Absolutely.
This is all so insightful. I feel like I'm already learning so much about what makes a frac job successful. And maximizing the performance of those wells, it's clear there's a lot of science and a lot of factors to think about.
There really is. And what's exciting is that this field is constantly evolving. New technologies and techniques emerging all the time.
I'm ready to learn more. We've covered a lot already, but there's still so much more to explore.
Yeah, there's definitely more to uncover. We've talked about designing those fractures effectively.
Right.
But how do we actually measure the impact of that frac job?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. How do we know if all this engineering is actually working? Like, how do we measure the effectiveness of the whole operation?
So there's this concept called folds of increase, or FOI.
Okay.
And it basically tells us how much production increases after a frac job.
Got it.
So it's like a report card for the whole thing.
Okay, FOI. So higher FOI means a more successful frac job. More bang for your buck.
Exactly. But here's something interesting. Even a less than ideal fracture design can still lead to significant production increases.
Really?
Yeah. The source material actually gives a real-world example.
Oh, wow.
They looked at an offshore well with a CFD that wasn't quite in that sweet spot we talked about.
Okay.
And despite that, the frac job still boosted oil production significantly. It went from producing 400 cubic meters per day to 700.
Wow. Even with a so-called bad design, that's a huge jump.
It is.
So even if you don't hit that magic CFD of 2,
Right.
fracking can still be a valuable tool.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding what influences FOI is so important. It helps engineers make those smart decisions about fracture design, even when they're working with, less than ideal conditions.
So besides CFD, what else affects FOI?
Well, we already talked about permeability being a major player.
Right.
The more permeable the rock formation, the greater the potential for that production boost after fracking.
Okay.
But there's another factor here, drainage radius.
Drainage radius, what is that?
Okay, so think of it as the area a well can pull from. It's basically the distance to the nearest flow boundary.
Okay.
So that could be a physical barrier, like a fault, or just the area already being drained by a nearby well.
So I'm picturing it like a zone of influence around each well.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does that drainage radius impact FOI?
So imagine you're trying to draw water from a small pond versus a vast lake.
Okay.
Even a large bucket isn't going to make much difference in the lake's overall water level.
Right.
Same idea applies here. A fracture closer to a boundary, like that nearby well, will have less impact on overall production.
That makes sense, yeah. Larger drainage radius, more room for the fracture to, work its magic.
Exactly.
Higher FOI, it's all about maximizing that zone of influence.
You got it. And it really highlights why it's so important to consider the big picture, that geological context, when designing these frac jobs.
Right.
It's not just about the fracture itself, it's how that fracture interacts with the surrounding rock and those nearby wells.
It's all connected, like a puzzle, fitting all those pieces together. Speaking of different pieces, we talked about acid fracturing as an alternative to propped fracturing. Does this FICO concept apply to acid fracking as
It
well?
does. The mechanism might be different.
Okay,
Edging the rock with acid instead of using that proppant.
right.
But the goal is the same. Boost production,
Got it.
and FOI helps us quantify that, regardless of the method.
So whether you're propping or etching, it's about maximizing that flow.
Exactly. And just like that Route 66 and Loop 610 analogy, the choice between acid and propped fracturing often comes down to the specific personality of that rock formation.
Right, choosing the right strategy for the situation. But I'm curious, are there ever cases where acid fracturing might actually be the better choice, even in those low permeability formations where we usually think proppant?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. Sometimes acid can actually be the better option, even in those less than ideal permeability scenarios. The source material mentions a few.
Oh, interesting.
For instance, some formations are just incredibly hard, what we call high moduluses.
Okay.
Acid's etching power can be more effective than proppant in these cases, creating those high conductivity pathways, even when the rock is really resistant to those typical fracturing methods.
So it's like sometimes acid's ability to eat through that rock outweighs those potential limitations of a shorter fracture length.
Exactly. Another scenario is when you have naturally fractured carbonates.
Okay.
These formations already have existing cracks, and the acid can use those as pathways, penetrating deeper into the rock,
Interesting.
creating a more extensive network.
Like it's got its own built-in highway system.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. So the choice between acid and proppant, it's not always so clear-cut.
Really?
Really comes down to understanding the geology of that specific formation.
Absolutely. And as technology evolves, we're learning even more about how to optimize both acid and proppant techniques for all these different scenarios.
It's awesome to think about how much innovation is still happening in this field. But remember earlier when we were talking about transient flow,
Yeah,
we've been focusing on that steady state flow so far.
right,
But what happens during that initial transient flow period
right.
that can have a huge impact on the well's overall performance?
It definitely can. Transient flow, it adds a whole new layer of complexity,
Yeah.
but it's crucial to understand if we want to accurately predict that well's long-term production.
So remind me again, why is this transient flow period so important?
It's a time of higher than expected production early on in a well's life.
Right,
And as we discussed, it can last for months or even years.
right.
This boost in production, it's driven by these unique flow dynamics near the fracture face.
Okay.
And it can really make a difference in that well's profitability.
It's like getting a bonus up front,
Exactly.
but you can't rely on that bonus forever.
Exactly.
So how do engineers actually account for this when designing a frac job?
It requires a deeper understanding of those different flow regimes that happen during a well's life. The source material actually breaks it down into 4 distinct stages.
Okay.
We have fracture linear flow, bilinear flow, formation linear flow, and finally pseudoradial flow.
Wow, a lot of different flows.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
It sounds complex.
It is.
Can you walk me through what makes each stage unique?
Absolutely. So imagine the fracture like a newly oboe highway.
Okay.
Initially, you have that fracture linear flow where oil and gas are moving quickly and directly within the fracture itself,
Got it.
like cars zooming down an empty freeway.
Makes sense.
But soon, traffic starts entering that highway from the surrounding roads. This is like bilinear flow.
Okay.
You have linear flow within the fracture, and then linear flow from the formation into the fracture.
Getting busier, more cars joining the flow.
Exactly. Now, if that fracture has high conductivity, meaning it can handle a lot of flow,
Yeah.
you might reach a stage called formation linear flow.
Okay.
Here, the flow within the fracture is so efficient that it's actually the flow from the formation that becomes the limiting factor. Think of it like having a wide-open highway, but those feeder roads are getting backed up.
Oh, interesting. So the bottleneck isn't the highway itself, it's those smaller roads leading in.
Exactly. And finally, as that pressure spreads further out into the formation,
Yeah.
we reach pseudoradial flow. Here, the flow pattern becomes more radial, spreading outward from that wellbore,
Okay.
like ripples in a pond.
So it's a very dynamic process.
It is.
Starts with that initial rush within the fracture and then settles into that more stable radial flow as the pressure spreads.
Precisely. And understanding those different flow regimes is key to accurately predicting that well's long-term performance.
Got it.
Transient flow can give a big boost to early production,
Right.
but it eventually fades, and the well settles into that more predictable pattern.
That makes sense. It's important to look at both the short-term and long-term picture.
Exactly.
This is so much more insightful than just looking at those initial production numbers.
It is. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dives,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that this field is constantly evolving.
Mm-hmm.
New technologies, techniques, always being developed, really pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
That's what makes it so fascinating.
Yes.
Always something new to discover and learn. Wow, we've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have.
From fracture design to permeability, even those different flow regimes, it's clear there's a lot that goes into making a frac job successful.
Mhm.
But before we wrap things up, there's one more concept from this document you sent that I'm really intrigued by. Something called type curves?
Oh yeah, type curves, those are fascinating. They're a really good way to visualize and analyze that transient flow behavior we were just talking about.
Okay.
They're essentially graphical representations of how those production rates change over time for different types of wells.
So instead of just looking at raw numbers, you can actually see those flow patterns over time.
Right, exactly.
That sounds really helpful. How do these type curves actually help engineers understand what's happening down there in the well?
They're like a roadmap for that transient flow. By comparing actual well performance to these theoretical models, engineers can get insights into, is the fracture design working? And they can even get a better understanding of the reservoir's characteristics.
So you can see how those factors like fracture conductivity or reservoir permeability influence those early production rates.
Right.
It's like comparing your road trip progress to your planned itinerary. You can see where you're ahead of schedule and where you might hit some unexpected delays. And you know what? The source material actually uses a low permeability gas well, as an example,
Yeah, they do.
showing how these type curves reveal the different flow behaviors for wells with those different CFD values.
It's a great example. It really highlights how type curves can differentiate between wells with those varying performance characteristics. In that case, the type curve for the lower CFD well shows a gradual decline in production, which is typical of that bilinear flow. But the higher CFD well, it shows a steeper initial decline, characteristic of formation linear flow, but eventually it kind of converges with that lower CFD well's production trend.
Oh, interesting. So even though they start off differently, those two wells end up following a similar path in the long run.
Exactly. It's like two different routes that eventually lead to the same destination.
Makes sense. And that's why understanding that transient flow is so important.
Right.
Those early production spikes, they'll eventually fade and the well will settle into that more predictable pattern.
Yeah, those type curves really help visualize that whole interplay between those initial bursts and then that eventual steady-state flow.
They're like a window into the future of the well's production. It seems like having that kind of insight would be invaluable for making those decisions about fracture design. Knowing those initial high rates won't last forever, you don't want to get overly optimistic with your projections.
You're exactly right. Transient flow is kind of like a bonus in those early stages, but you really need to design for the long haul.
For the long game,
Yeah, that steady-state flow.
where it's all going to settle eventually.
Exactly.
Wow, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive. We've gone from the basic idea of fracking all the way to these really intricate details of fracture design, permeability, drainage radius, acid fracturing, transient flow, and now these type curves.
It's a lot.
It really is. It's amazing how much goes into maximizing that effectiveness of a frac job.
It is a very multifaceted process, and it really highlights the need for that holistic approach.
Yeah.
By considering all these factors, engineers can make informed decisions that lead to better well performance and ultimately more efficient resource recovery.
I feel so much more informed about this whole world beneath our feet.
Good.
We've just scratched the surface.
We have.
But this deep dive has definitely piqued my curiosity to learn even more. What are some of the exciting advancements on the horizon for hydraulic fracturing?
There's a lot of exciting research and development happening right now. For example, there are advancements in proppant technology
Oh, cool.
that could lead to even higher conductivity fractures, boosting those production rates even further.
Wow.
And there are new fracturing fluids being developed with better properties for controlling fluid loss and transporting proppants,
Okay.
which could allow for those longer, more complex fractures, allowing us to access even more of those resources.
The future sounds full of possibilities. It's amazing to think about the potential for even more efficient and effective techniques.
It really is. And as we continue to learn more about the science behind fracturing and those unique characteristics of different rock formations, these advancements are only going to accelerate,
That's great.
which means even greater resource recovery and a more sustainable energy future for everyone.
That's an inspiring thought to end on. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the world of hydraulic fracturing. I hope you, our listeners, have enjoyed this journey as much as I have. It's definitely complex, but understanding these concepts is key to navigating the ever-evolving energy landscape. Until next time, keep on learning and keep on diving.